Despair consumes the soul.
Here we have the sequel to the surprisingly enjoyable and far superior Layers of Fear, a short but often gripping psychological thriller that left its mark amongst other similar titles, but where that smaller game from 2016 just succeeded in so many areas, I really can't say the same for the sequel, which is disappointing. Layers of Fear 2 is a perfect example that not all sequels in gaming are indeed better. Whereas many elevate a series quite often to greatness, with the first game often being a test case before a series truly hits its mark with the next game, Layers of Fear 2 fails to expand and improve upon its initial successful outing. For the few areas that Layers of Fear 2 succeeds upon, it's held back in several others, which really brings the game down, and it's in these areas in which the game needs to succeed most, and where the first game was such a triumph. So let's board this cruise liner and see what Layers of Fear 2 does well, but ultimately see why an iceberg wasn't needed to take down this ship. Let's focus on the core aspects of any psychological, story-driven game or horror game, and that is whether the game delivers on what it needs to be. This can be split into several areas as well. We'll start with taking a look at whether the game does actually scare the player, and of course, this will differ amongst different people. We have the traditional and more simplistic jump scares make an appearance in Layers of Fear 2, but then we also have the psychological elements, which in my opinion are much more important in regarding these style of games as a success or failure. Disappointingly, the game failed to deliver in either area for me. Whilst moving your character around the ship, you'll come into contact with a large number of mannequins which move and contort based upon a certain scene or what the story or narration is telling you. These can also manifest themselves by quickly appearing and then disappearing in typical horror fashion. Whichever was being presented to me, I can't recall any time where this actually scared or frightened me, and that's with the accompanying music to emphasize the visuals at times. It all fell completely flat. It felt so forced. There were very few scenarios where we get to some other enemies or figures, which I'll speak about soon, and these offered some much needed change, but they also came with their own problems, which weren't so much scary as they were frustrating due to the poor game design. What works hand in hand alongside whether the game is considered scary is that of the setting and the tension, and whether these parts come together successfully to deliver a classic scary game. And again, Layers of Fear 2 was just so disappointing. The first Layers of Fear nailed its setting, even though it was riddled with cliches, an often dark, creepy old mansion in the middle of a thunderstorm. The lighting and darkness creating a sense of dread of moving forward, and that's without taking into account the great sound and music, or lack thereof, that accompanied the entire game. The setting for the second game on a cruise liner was a great idea, working your way through the different areas, with special mention going to the last chapter, which impressed me visually and was such a great setting, which is wasted with the problems the game has. Throughout my playtime, I could see that the game was trying to build this tension, to put the player on edge at all times, not knowing when something was going to jump out at you or be shown to you. When tension is done successfully, such as in the first game, it means the players are putting themselves in a psychological state for the game to take advantage of. This means that when the game actually does have a proper scare, its impact is heightened and results in physical symptoms, sweaty palms, quickened breathing, your heart pumping faster, or players needing to take a break as they are somewhat stressed from what they're experiencing. The first game would often put the player on edge when you expect something to happen, but it may never eventuate. Or something may happen when you thought it would, or something would occur when you thought it wouldn't. It would constantly have the player guessing and have them aware of the surroundings and the environment. It was done effectively and it knew what it wanted to be. These games exist to inject fear and terror in the player, but unfortunately, the more I played of Layers of Fear 2, all it was injecting was frustration due to design decisions, a lackluster story and delivery, and me wanting the game to end. So now let's take a look at those other scenarios I mentioned, which breaks up the moment-to-moment gameplay of moving around the ship, looking at objects and opening doors. So many doors. Players will be introduced to a certain silhouetted enemy which will appear several times throughout the game, and in terms of its design and visual and sound effects that occur when it happens, it's a great inclusion to the story. But then of course, things fall apart once again. If this figure gets to you, then it simply kills you and you restart at a checkpoint. This can lead to simple trial and error in order to progress, and which completely kills the tension and my interest in the story. I had a similar issue with the fantastic A Plague Tale Innocence, but whereas that game delivered greatly in many areas, this is just another disappointment in Layers of Fear 2. These sorts of games run a very fine line between a classic game and gameplay and telling a story with characters in a setting filled with tension and atmosphere. Once that is broken, it's hard to get back, and sadly Layers of Fear 2 broke that for me numerous times. There were even a couple of times where these scenarios simply made me want to stop playing. I would eventually progress after several attempts, but by then I had basically switched off from the game and was just going through the motions. Now, I'm a person who enjoys many types of games, but even though I wouldn't classify Layers of Fear 2 as an outright bad game, for this reviewer, it was just a boring one. The original Layers of Fear is a classic example of why sometimes less is more. But let's talk about something positive about the game. Overall, it's a very good looking game, especially the last chapter, which I made special mention of earlier. Being on a large ship, you will be seeing countless corridors with rooms coming off them, but there was enough variety between them all to keep them interesting and to keep pushing forward. I'd say that none of the environments really outstays their welcome, and it means even more when the entire game is really set within the same small confines of a ship. One area I wish they had improved upon would be in the interactivity between the player and environment. There are times when you're able to turn on the water in a bathroom, for example, but nothing else in the environment apart from cupboards can really be interacted with. With the amount of chairs, books and other objects scattered around the place, I'd expect to be able to knock them over or move them somehow, but it isn't to be. Everything feels like it's set in concrete with a look but don't touch sign posted onto it. It can break the immersion somewhat, as I felt like I was walking around a static painting or photo instead of being in a real environment. The story of Layers of Fear 2 has an interesting premise whereby you play an actor who comes aboard the cruise ship, and I'm not wanting to delve into anything significant surrounding the story, but I felt like it never really interested me all that much, as I had to deal with the other problems surrounding the game. Just like the first game, players are plunged into this environment, which can often be turned into a surreal setting with the environmental manipulation that the game employs. But whereas the first game was somewhat subtle in areas it needed to be, Layers of Fear 2 feels like it was trying to impress me with everything it possibly could. And I go back to what I said before, less is more. It may work in terms of telling the story and be visually impressive, but it didn't work as a game in which I interacted with, nor did it provide that creepiness and mood which put me on the edge of my seat. As if Layers of Fear 2 is trying to be more complicated and complex in each area when compared to the first game, but in each of those areas, it falls short. Voice work is very hit and miss, with some lacking the necessary emotion for me to care about any of these characters or the story in which they exist. They get the job done, but without any real emotional investment in the story or the characters, I was simply playing to finish the game. The only real standout in terms of voice work was the narration of Tony Todd, which I knew from the Candyman series of movies. A perfect voice for this style of game, but even with that, without having much of an interest in the story, it was a great part of an otherwise mediocre game. Music for the most part is kept to a minimum, which is disappointing after the great score that accompanied the first game, but also because the lack of music does not add to the tension or mood at all, which was such a great strength of the original. Playing through a game just to finish it is never a good situation, and it points to another problem with the game, and that's in its length. It's just too long. The first Layers of Fear never overstayed its welcome, but the sequel feels like it's full of padding in order to deliver a longer game, but it just ends up hurting the narrative. In an effort to become a longer game and introduce different elements to what players have already experienced, it overstays its welcome. If the story and length could have been condensed and given us a shorter game, then the whole may have been a stronger title. Layers of Fear 2 is a disappointing follow-up to a genuinely creepy and atmospheric psychological thriller that the original game was. Its detailed graphics, surreal imagery, and interesting premise doesn't make up for its lackluster storytelling, lack of scares, and its overly long length, which does nothing but impact the game negatively. If a Layers of Fear 3 is ever released, I would hope it goes back to basics and ultimately remember that when it comes to horror or thrillers, whether games or movies, what we don't see is just as important as what we do see.